Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this another, what I hope will be a wonderful Auckland Conversations event. My name is Anthony Cross from Auckland Transport, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all here and to, I guess, to start with, to mention our sponsors for this event this evening, Consultants T2 and MR Cagney. Thank you to both of those companies for enabling this event to happen. We're going to be hearing about cycling. I'm a bit of a yet to be fully converted cyclist myself, I guess. I'm one of those people who cycled to school and cycled to university. And when I went to visit a friend in Sydney last year, she suggested we go cycling one day, and I thought that was the silliest suggestion I'd ever heard. But she had a spare bike, and so off we set. And I had a wonderful day exploring Sydney by bike. And experiencing the amazing cycle infrastructure that they're developing in that city. And so it's very, very exciting, of course, to see that the beginnings of that happening here in Auckland, especially with the recent opening of the Grafton Gully and Beach Road cycleways, and on the part of Auckland Transport that we've now set up a dedicated walking and cycling group to further that effort. And so here's hoping that we're on the brink of something really exciting in terms of one of the active modes here in Auckland. I'm going to hand over now to Pippa Mitchell from T2, who's going to introduce our speakers from Canada, and then we'll look forward to hearing their presentation, and then of course there'll be an opportunity afterwards for questions to them. So, Pippa.
Good evening, everyone. As Anthony said, I work at T2 Engineers. We're a medium-sized traffic consultancy. We do a lot of public transport and walking and cycling infrastructure. It's my pleasure tonight to introduce Chris and Melissa Bruntlett, who will present a fresh perspective on cycling as a central voice of Vancouver's emerging citizen cyclist movement. Focused on utility over speed and riding in street clothes rather than Lycra, they make cycling an everyday act of pleasurable and sustainable mobility. Chris and Melissa and their two children, Etienne and Coralie, sold their family car in 2010. They have surprised many, not least of all themselves, with how practical and easy and enjoyable two-wheeled travel can be. This includes a multitude of trips to school and activities that are an inevitable part of parenthood. Melissa blogs about their experiences at Modacity, which attracts global audiences fascinated with the many triumphs and few challenges of their car-free urban lifestyle. Their family's mobility is facilitated by a city that has done better than most in North America to provide bicycle infrastructure for people of all ages and abilities. Chris and Melissa will focus on what safe and accessible space for cycling means in practical terms for experiencing the pleasures of the city and participating in public life. Their presentation will include a selection of the Vancouver Cycle Chic films produced by Chris, which intimately profile a number of Vancouverites who cycle for transportation, demonstrating that riding a bike is a way to be a part of the city, not apart from the city. One of the films, Heart and Soul, was recently awarded Best Bicycle Short Film at the New Urbanism Film Festival in Los Angeles. They're near the end of their tour of New Zealand. They've had a whirlwind stop through Wellington, and then they went and presented at the 2 Walk and Cycle conference that was held in Nelson this year, where, according to the blog, they did the most networking they have ever done in 48 hours. Now up in Auckland, they've already tried out our brand new Beach Road and Grafton Gully cycleways, accompanied by a few of their newfound friends at the Transport Blog and Generation Zero. You can keep up with them on their blog and find out about their adventures as they go along. Please join me in welcoming Chris and Melissa.
You're going on that side. lapel mics are working. Okay,
Yeah,
great.
sorry.
Thanks for coming, everybody. This has been just an amazing experience, as Pippa was saying. We came to New Zealand just 7 or 8 days ago, and it's been an absolute whirlwind. We're actually heading back to Vancouver tomorrow, but it's been just so humbling and so energizing to be here around the people and to see what we think is the start of something special. But we'll get into that a little bit later. So, brief introduction. Melissa and I, like Pippa was saying, we've lived in Vancouver for the past 7 or 8 years, and we've spent that time experiencing the change in bike culture there, both as on our own as a family. We have 2 small children. Our son is 5 and our daughter is 8. And we've seen a lot of positive change, and that's been a result of a shift in cycling strategy towards infrastructure for all ages and abilities. So tonight we're going to talk to you about where we started from and how the conditions have improved to make cycling more accessible to the average person.
So on a personal note, Pippa had mentioned that we sold our car in 2010, and what Vancouver has done has allowed us to do that while still maintaining mobility as a family of 4. It was due to interest shortly after we sold the car and started cycling around that we started writing about our experiences and profiling it in lots of imagery and film. Myself, 2 years ago, I started the Velo Family Diary blog, which has then evolved into Modacity. And Chris joined up with Vancouver Cycle Chic to, again, profile those Vancouverites that are just getting around by bicycle as an extension of walking or transit, and really representing the idea of style over speed. So after those successes, Pippa mentioned some awards, we decided to join forces, and that's how we are here today as Modacity, to share the freedom and simplicity of the multimodal lifestyle. So 6 years ago, this is what Vancouver looked like on the streets in terms of cycling culture. It was a little more aggressive, a little dangerous, and prohibitive to the average cyclist like myself and Chris. The cycling was really only for the fit and the brave, and the demographic of most cyclists on the road was predominantly male.
So the city itself was relatively inaccessible on a bicycle. The bike network itself was situated on the back streets, and in the odd instance where it came onto main streets, it was really just paint in the door zone of cars and sharrows where cyclists were expected to share the lane with buses and cars. This kept the cyclists out of sight and out of mind for the motorists, and resulted in a homogenous bike culture where everyone basically wore the cycling uniform, which was the Gore-Tex getup. They dressed like the warriors that they were expected to be, basically. So in 2008, we saw a shift that we alluded to towards bike infrastructure for people of all ages and abilities. And that started with a new mayor, Gregor Robertson, and a new majority in council from the Vision Vancouver party. Gregor himself was a cyclist, but he recognized that he was an anomaly. He realized that, in order to grow bicycle mode share, they had to address the concerns of those 60 to 70% of Vancouverites who were concerned but interested but concerned in cycling. So that resulted in the planning and building of a AAA network. That's for all ages and abilities, and the other phrase that they use is cycling for 8 to 80. So they want to build cycle tracks that are safe for 8-year-olds and also for 80-year-olds. And that also took the bike infrastructure from the back streets and put them on arterial roads where people actually want to travel.
So essentially, the city of Vancouver spent the last 6 years building these new lanes and providing connections throughout the city for the citizens of the city. The Vision Vancouver has spent a lot of political capital to do it, and despite opposition, won a clear majority again in 2011, and look to repeat that again in our elections in just about 2 weeks. The council and the mayors are essentially looking ahead and have set an aspirational goal of being the greenest city in the world by 2020. And that should include 50% of all trips made by the citizens of Vancouver by either bicycle, foot, or public transport.
So we are going to quickly run through those 6 pieces of infrastructure that were built over the last 6 years. The first was the Burrard Street Bridge. You can see a photo here of our friend Darren riding just a couple of weeks ago. We gave him the tour of most of these 6 pieces of infrastructure. So the bridge itself was an 80-year-old historic structure, 6 lanes of cars at moving 60 kilometers an hour, and one of the major portals into the downtown peninsula. We have 3 bridges, and basically everything that travels into the downtown has to go through one of those 3 bridges. So what they ended up doing was reallocating one of those lanes of traffic to a protected cycle lane in one direction, and then reallocated the sidewalk on the other side of the bridge for bicycle traffic in the other direction. So we had 2 one-way cycle tracks going in and out of the city. Those were concrete barriers just due to the speed of the cars. And as you can see on the slide, it was an immediate success with bicycle traffic increasing almost overnight by at least 30%.
I went too far, sorry. There we go. The next section of cycle tracks that opened up in Vancouver was the viaduct, or Dunsmuir Viaduct as we call it. It was approved about 1 month after our 2010 Olympics, using an already closed off lane that had been permanently shut to facilitate all those glorious glass towers being built that you see behind. So it was very easy to repurpose that. The viaduct itself is a 500-meter remnant of an abandoned highway project that was set to put a highway straight through the city of Vancouver, connecting our major Highway 1 with the North Shore. But the neighborhoods of Strathcona and Chinatown, which would have been severed by the highway, fought vehemently against it and won, and this was in the 70s, so now this viaduct is the leftovers of the project that started. What the viaduct does is provides a vital connection directly into downtown from East Vancouver, where there are a lot of bedroom communities, much like our own. So it's easy access straight into the downtown core. And then the second section extends that viaduct pathway into downtown along Dunsmuir Street, removing just 1 lane of traffic on a single direction road. Essentially what this does is provide safe and separated infrastructure into downtown, and it also connects with a lot of our major sporting venues. So the hockey is played in that dome, and the football, or soccer, however you want to call it, is played in the building just next door, which we end up using quite a bit to get to various sporting events. There's also lots of businesses in the downtown and shopping centers, so it's a great way to get there without having to rely on car traffic. It also links with 2 SkyTrain stations, which is our tramway, and lots of major bus routes. And the viaduct portion, as you can see in that picture on the left, is separated again by that separate cement barrier, because traffic along there tends to get upwards of 70 kilometers an hour. But then once you get into the downtown area, that's separated by lovely planter boxes and bike corrals to facilitate parking for all the cyclists coming into town. Did it work?
So after Dunsmuir Street was completed, later that year, the city identified a north-south route, and they ultimately ended up choosing Hornby Street, which connects right down the center of the downtown peninsula from the Burrard Street Bridge, which was the first piece that we mentioned, to the north waterfront, which includes a convention center, and also crisscrosses with the Dunsmuir bike lane. It passes along the law courts, the Robson Square, the art gallery, numerous hotels, cafes, and businesses. It is a bi-directional cycle track, so it's 2-way traffic, two-way bicycle traffic on a one-way street. And it's also what the city did in order to facilitate this. They removed about 150 car parking spaces But in the run-up to the project, they did a count of parking spaces in the area, and every single on-street parking spot that was removed was replaced by a space either on a city-side street or on a multi-story parkade.
I did. Impressed. Oh, see, now I'm going to go too far again. Okay, got it.
And then after Hornby Street, we have the Comox-Helmken Greenway, which was a smaller project which ran from Hornby Street out through the west end of Vancouver, which is one of our densest neighborhoods. There's lots of high-rise apartment buildings. And it was really branded as a walking and cycling greenway. It wasn't just about bicycles. It was about the children that want to walk to school or cycle to school, and also upgrades to some of the public spaces around there in terms of seating and what have you. In terms of the project itself, the cycling is mostly separated from traffic with a small concrete curb, as you can see there. There are some spaces where the bikes share with automobiles, but the streets themselves are quite traffic calmed, and there's not a lot of automobile traffic that runs through there.
The second to last piece of infrastructure that we're going to speak about today was just completed this past spring, which would be May for us, and was the Union Street cycle track. Essentially what this did is extended an already existing bike boulevard and separated it in front of the businesses on Union Street and then into Expo Boulevard, which can be quite busy. It's essentially a thoroughfare from, again, those bedroom communities in East Vancouver through to Chinatown, Gastown, and Yaletown, where there's lots of restaurants and shopping. And it also is the connection to the Dunsmuir Viaduct that will lead into downtown. Previously, this section was serviced by sharrows and a painted lane and in the door zone, but the city identified it for separation because of the sheer volume of cars that was traveling past. We have a policy in Vancouver that if there is 500 or more cars passing through a shared space with bicycles, that it is designated for separation for safety reasons. So this is the end product. The bicycles are separated by parked cars and bike corrals, which then help to service the businesses along Union Street, which include restaurants, cafes, and many retailers, and remove just a limited number of parking spaces and calmed these streets, so it's a much nicer place for walking and cycling now.
And last but not least, we have the Point Grey bikeway, which just opened this past summer. And it really, Vancouver has a pretty spectacular seawall network, which we are constantly riding. You can almost ride around the entire perimeter of the city along the water, 30 plus kilometers, walking, scooting, cycling, jogging, rollerblading, you name it. And there's very little intrusion from cars. And this 3-kilometer stretch connected that seawall network out to the westernmost beaches, and now makes those beaches accessible for families like ours who wouldn't otherwise ride out there. This Point Grey road previously was quite an unpleasant stretch. It saw upwards of 10,000 cars a day, and very few people, I will say, felt safe riding on there. They would often ride on the pavement or just not bother at all. So this opened up with physical separation and traffic calming this past summer, and has really seen a boost in families getting out there evenings, weekends, and the like, cycling out to the beaches for a picnic, and we can attest that it's really transformed that neighborhood for the better.
So we've talked about lots of infrastructure, and it's all been fantastic for the city, but it's not enough infrastructure alone. The city has come up with some bike-friendly policies to encourage that bike-curious citizen. What that's included is lower speed limits on lots of the bikeways and anywhere where there are pathways, so most have speeds of 30 kilometers or less. And that, of course, is improving the road safety for all users, whether they're cyclists, pedestrians, and even motorists. We also have bike buses, where you can load up your bike on the front of a bus and extend your journey depending on how far you want to travel. We actually, the TransLink, which is our national or regional transport authority, has a mandate that all buses servicing the Metro Vancouver area have to have the bike racks on them to facilitate those longer multimodal trips. We also have the SkyTrain with adequate space for cycling, or for bicycles. Again, improving that connectivity and then also allowing for much further trips. So ourselves, we managed to make it all the way out to Vancouver Island without ever having to take a car or ride on the motorway, which was fantastic for us.
So while Vancouver's definitely made great strides in terms of infrastructure and policy, we're seeing a couple of areas where the policy isn't keeping up with the infrastructure. Bike parking is another, is front and center in that discussion, in that we're not providing enough parking for the number of people riding bicycles, and the demand is far exceeding the supply. That's a shot of our typical trip to a restaurant. We end up, our family, locking our bikes to a tree or a fence or a parking meter. So the city has really kind of failed to keep up with the demand for parking, and we're pushing them in that area. It's an important policy that needs to be considered. And then there are other policies around the Motor Vehicle Act, which is our rules and regulations, provincial rules and regulations for all vehicles on the road, and somehow bicycles fall under the Motor Vehicle Act. So there are a lot of outdated policies in there around riding abreast, so riding side by side, the seemingly benign act of somebody sitting on the back of your bicycle is prohibited by law, and then there's the helmet mandation, which we'll touch on a little bit later. But these are all policies that really need to be reconsidered and modernized to keep pace with the changing bike culture that's going on.
Okay, did I go too far? No, that's it. Okay, sorry.
Bike lash. Everybody gets it. It's an inevitable, side effect of progress, and we saw our fair share of it in Vancouver. Almost every single project that we previously spoke about had some kind of vehement vocal opposition, and it was unfortunate, but it ultimately, didn't halt progress. So we summarized them in four different ways, four different complaints that we would get. The first is parking, and I'm sure it's something that you can attest to here, is the fear that the loss of 2 parking spaces outside a business will somehow be the end of the world for a given business. Secondly, we have the speculation that that sliver of road space that you're taking out for a cycle track is going to create traffic chaos, and as we'll touch on later, it didn't really happen in Vancouver. The third concern is around costs, and I think it's while it's a somewhat genuine concern, the vast amounts of money that Vancouver spends on automobile-centric infrastructure, the bicycle budget still remains less than 2% of the overall transportation budget. And finally, we have the scofflaw cyclist myth, I guess, and the belief that the building of cycle lanes will just cater to that illegal law-breaking danger to society in terms of pavement cycling and stop sign running and the like. So the city was really proactive on all 4 of those fronts, and they met all of those concerns with facts. They did a lot of open houses, a lot of conversations. Sometimes that resulted in compromise, but for the most part, they really stuck to their guns, and to their credit, they pushed these projects through, and we're now seeing the benefits in the aftermath of that.
Sorry, I'm pushing the button. There we go. So as we mentioned, each new infrastructure has been a success both in ridership and the overall safety of the people using it. Those 60% that Chris mentioned, concerned but interested, are now making up a bulk of the increases in our riders on the streets of Vancouver. And it's really an encouraging statistic, or all of these are encouraging statistics, proving that the city in general is on the right track to really moving cycling into the forefront and making it a better place for all its citizens. I only pressed it once, I swear.
There you go.
Okay. So keeping in mind the opposition that Chris mentioned earlier, so parking, congestion, and what have you, the numbers coming out from the city pretty much are debunking many of the concerns from the average citizens. With regards to driving time, the impact has been pretty much negligible, with most commute times increasing by the average of 1 to 3 minutes, which, I mean, if you're stuck in traffic for 10 minutes, what's 1 more minute, really? Collisions have also dramatically decreased with better signage, better driver and cyclist education, and sidewalk cycling has all but disappeared, specifically in the downtown peninsula where it was a problem before. But most importantly, the number of children and women that are now riding in the downtown and out to Point Grey has seen a distinct spike since the infrastructure has gone in. It's an indication that with improved changes and separation, cyclists feel an overall sense of safety, and they're comfortable with riding even with their most vulnerable. The quantitative results prove that while the opposition and worry over the changes was completely unfounded, and have helped to improve the overall quality of the city for all of its people. Is it working up there? No? There we go.
Cool. All right, so that was kind of the brick and mortar side of things. But Melissa and I are really interested in the more qualitative successes that have come out of all of this infrastructure that's being built, how that affects the average Vancouverite, the type of people that are getting on bicycles. And we've seen a significant change in the last 5 or 6 years towards a slower, simpler, more civilized bike culture. This has made cycling more accessible and more diverse, and perhaps more importantly, it's taken cycling off the back streets and put it front and center on the city's consciousness. So in our work for Vancouver Cycle Chic and Modacity, we've seen a number of specific changes in the bike culture in Vancouver, and we'll talk about those extensively right now.
I'm going to give this to you in a second. There we go. So, back there. So with this adoption of the slower, more simple cycling in Vancouver, there's been a revitalization of the classic upright bicycle. Some of you rode in with some of those today, and they're quite beautiful. The Dutch bikes are built for utility instead of sport, and they make things like running errands, grocery shopping, and what have you much easier. The upright bicycle is overall more easy to ride, and more appealing to the bike curious who need a bike that is comfortable and simply to get around the city. The added bonus is that when you're sitting upright, it allows riders to feel more connected to their city and the spaces they're passing, and encourages increased sociability and really facilitates multiple stops. Upright bikes provide the simplicity and a complete bicycle, so that means they come fully equipped with fenders, lights, chain guards, belts, skirt guards for myself, which are all essential for everyday citizen cycling. And it makes it easier just to get up and get on your bike and go, much like just putting on your shoes and stepping out the door and going for a walk. I need it, I'm gonna give it to you. There we go.
So that cycling as an extension of walking is a theme that we find ourselves constantly repeating. And it's the biggest change really that we've seen is a shift from the concept of running or jogging with wheels to walking with wheels. So the bicycle becomes an extension of walking and or the public transit system. As such, the idea of cycle-specific clothing becomes redundant, and dressing for the destination becomes the most important thing. In turn, cycling becomes more appealing to a broad audience, which we call the 99%. And this is the type of imagery that we have been presenting through our blogging and our Cycle Chic work, and that's presenting imagery to the regular Vancouverite that they can see and think to themselves, I could do that.
This is you.
Helmets. Okay. Melissa and I generally avoid the topic of helmets. We find it's an emotional distraction from more important conversations. However, we're seeing something really interesting happening in Vancouver, and we felt compelled to share it with everyone today. So as a result of the safe separated infrastructure that's being built, we're seeing fewer and fewer people riding with helmets. However, like New Zealand, the province of British Columbia also has a mandatory helmet law, which was passed in the 1990s, when all it existed was forward, fast-leaning cycling, and the infrastructure itself didn't. But with each cycle track that goes in, we're seeing fewer and fewer people riding with helmets. And Melissa and I see that as an encouraging sign that people feel safe, they feel comfortable, and then it comes back to the cycling as an extension of walking idea. The helmets themselves feel unnecessary, particularly on an upright bike and particularly on a separated cycle track. So as a result, the law itself in BC has become mostly unenforceable. The police will spend maybe 1 or 2 days a summer filling their quota of tickets. But Melissa and I ride 365 days a year without, and we know quite a few other people that do. We don't get bothered. Again, we see that as a sign of a bicycle culture that's maturing, and cycling is becoming more and more normalized. Oh, and I guess the last thing to mention, sorry, around helmets. And the helmet law is the barrier to bike share. And Vancouver's been studying bike share since 2009. We're really in a place where we would love a bike share scheme, but dropping hundreds of thousands of dollars on helmet vending machines is stopping us from doing that. And it becomes a very frustrating situation.
So, back to bikes. So as we mentioned, there is an increased number of women cycling on the streets of Vancouver, largely in part due to the proper infrastructure that's being provided to them. As more of the risk-averse gender, women tend to be less likely to drive or ride their bikes next to fast-moving cars. And so with seeing an increase in female ridership, it's an indication that cycling is now safe and a little more welcoming to the average citizen. When provided with proper infrastructure, multi-purpose trips that are generally more common in a woman's day-to-day life are better facilitated. So trips to the grocery store, to meet up with friends after work, pick up children from school, shopping, and the like are much easier. And in general, women are a little more likely to bike instead of driving to get to those destinations. For mothers like myself and many others, and gentlemen, when I say this, I mean no disrespect, but generally we are the decision makers in the household. So once we feel more comfortable riding around on our bicycles, we're also encouraged to ride with our children and increase the overall health and well-being of our families. And then because mothers and parents in general are now more comfortable riding with their children, there is a residual effect, and we are seeing a lot more children on bikes on the streets of Vancouver as well. Schools throughout the city are encouraging children to ride to school through safe routes to school programs, bike to school week events. There's lots of bike parking outside of most schools now, and they usually facilitate some sort of bike boulevard right near the schools to allow for those trips. The benefits are significant, not only in terms of health, but also in terms of the response in the classroom. So generally, children that are cycling or walking to school are more receptive in the classroom. They have, sorry, I lost my train of thought there. A better temperament, and they also have improved focus. So overall, there is just that added benefit that they're getting a better education because they're paying better attention in classrooms. In terms of the infrastructure, again, it facilitates those multi-purpose trips. So for myself, I spend most afternoons picking the children up from school and cycling them off to dance class, swimming, any other number of programs, and it's better facilitated because of the fact that I have the infrastructure to do that with the children. So really what it's doing is encouraging more time spent as a family, whether on those shorter trips or on long trips along the waterfront for fun on the weekends. And so the overall happiness and the quality of life for families like ours and others throughout the city is drastically improved. There. Oh. Got it.
So as the number of families riding increases, we're also seeing an increase in the number of cargo bikes, which has really popped up in the last just year or two. Many young families that we know have opted to invest in a cargo bike rather than a family automobile. In addition to children, they're helping transport other things like groceries, large purchases, and even pets. And then we're also seeing businesses in the city using cargo bikes to make deliveries. There's a donut shop in town, bakeries, and they all now are making their deliveries by cargo bike. This is all a result of friendlier streets on which to navigate. You certainly wouldn't see these type of vehicles rubbing shoulders with cars. And so one of the parents we know, or one of our friends of ours, Simon, who rides a bicycle, Back Fiat's cargo bike to transport his son and some of his art supplies around. We made a short film about him for Vancouver Cycle Chic, which we'll share for you, hopefully.
Yes.
Inspiration for my creative process is everything. It's from the point of waking up to the point of going to sleep. You're constantly looking and taking in visuals, and that's what inspires me. It's just everything inspires me. Just cycling around, walking around, and absorbing. You use the tools you have at hand, and a bike plays in that collection of creative impulses or visuals. With cycling, what is great about that is I can be cycling down the road and if something catches my eye, whether it's a window on an apartment or some garbage that's been left behind in an alleyway, I can just pull over. It also sort of creeps into the work every once in a while as well. Bikes pop up into the paintings or the photos every once in a while. We brought our cargo bike over from Ireland. We had purchased it over there after seeing them in the Netherlands. We liked it better than the tow system because my son Tig is up front and we can see what he's doing and we don't have to take our eyes off the road. My favorite places in Vancouver to get to on a bike has to be just the neighborhoods and the alleyways. I love exploring with my son, and the back alleyways offer a great experience of Vancouver that is unique to here, I feel. People don't often see this three-wheel bike, and people are no different here than they were over in Ireland in that they will stop you to ask you questions about it. And so it's nice because it breaks up your day and you have these conversations with perfect strangers and they're just enthralled or they want to get one so they can bring their kid around. It's a nice occurrence that happens. My name is Simon Fleming. Recently moved to Vancouver from Galway, Ireland with my wife Nina and my son Tig. I'm a visual artist working in a variety of mediums from painting to photography to installation and sculpture.
Okay. Yay. So one encouraging note that we're starting to see in Vancouver is the demographic of the riders that across all ages and abilities throughout the city. So it's helping to prove the point that the bicycle is indeed the great equalizer. So citizens with physical limitations like chronic illness or disease are finding riding a bicycle is actually much easier than walking. And it allows them to maintain that control over their own mobility and provides that, again, that sense of health and well-being that they might lose if they were forced to travel by car all the time. In terms of the type of bicycle, really many cyclists, including myself, have made the switch over to that Dutch-style bicycle or the upright cycle because they experience less strain and pressure in their joints as they would when they were in a more forward-leaning position. And so because they're more comfortable, they feel more empowered and they ride more often. The next film we're going to show you features Cecily, who helps to really epitomize that idea of cycling being an equalizer for her daily commute.
I like to say that I have the best front yard in Vancouver. It has a heart and a soul that feels very organic. It just feels like the neighborhood is growing with me. I can't imagine living anywhere else. I have the best commute that I can think of. I go around the seawall. I get to see birds. I get to see runners and joggers and people with their dogs. I get to see natural beauty and the interesting shape of the man-made beauty that's taking on Vancouver. We've come so far just in the last few years that I've been riding. Again, it's just potential. And when you're in a place of potential, you can go anywhere. And so it's a really, really exciting place to be. It puts the city on a human level for me, and it just makes me feel like I'm a part of the city instead of feeling apart from the city. I don't really ride with destinations in mind. I'm just going out with an idea of what I want to see, what sort of people I want to see, what kind of scenery I want to see, and then I just sort of point my bike in a direction and sort of let fate direct me to wherever it is I'm going to go. I have rheumatoid arthritis, and as a result, I suffer from near chronic pain, not debilitating, sometimes it is, but as long as I can still wear high heels, I'm okay. And as long as I can keep riding my bike, I'm good. I worked at corporations my first few years out of library school, and then I decided to come to work at public libraries, and I love it. This is where I belong. It's a great place to come and people watch, and stuff is free. Well, I mean, your taxes are paying for it, but you can find things that you probably wouldn't ordinarily find anywhere else. It's just a great place. It's kind of pinko commie, the public library, but I'm kind of pinko commie, so it fits perfectly. My name is Cecily Walker. I live in the Olympic Village, and I'm a librarian in Vancouver.
So it's not just children that people are feeling safer riding with. We're now seeing more people riding with their pets as well. Whether it's riding along in a front or rear basket or alongside the bicycle, walking the dog is becoming a joy rather than a chore. Overall, this further establishes a more casual approach to cycling, making it a more everyday activity. And it's a more practical way to transport your pet, like our friend Amy, who cycles with her dog, Winston, because he's not allowed on the public transport system.
Oh, there's a
Winston likes to sleep in, and so I have to wake him up in the morning to get him his breakfast. After that, he just waits patiently until I'm ready to leave and take him out. It's so nice to have another being there that appreciates you and values you. There's just this bond that you don't have with anyone else. Winston has arthritis in his elbow, and as a result he walks with a limp, and so he needs to have some easier forms of transport. People love having pets. They give them health benefits, companionship, a reason to go outside, a reason to feel alive, and I'm lucky that I get to work to make sure that happens in a context that's great for animals too. Working at the SPCA has its perks. We all get to bring our pets into work. Winston really enjoys being in the office, and he actually makes my workplace a happier place for my colleagues. I feel very lucky because I get to live my dream life. My name is Amy. My dog's name is Winston, and I work to make change for animals.
Oh, I pushed it too far. Damn. Back. There we go. So while the bicycle has been an important transportation tool growing in the city, it's also become an excellent tool for sociability and staying connected with the people around us. Over the years, we've been quite privileged to take part in countless organized rides and spontaneous group rides as well. They're all basically focused on the simple act of enjoying the city on two wheels. So various groups have cropped up, not dissimilar to some of the Frux rides I've been hearing about, that host monthly themed rides like vintage bike rides, and then also the solstice ride like the image above, which took us on our longest day all the way out to Point Grey.
The image on the bottom is of the annual Vancouver Bike Rave, which is one of the cooler things that's popped up in recent years. It's exactly what it sounds like. One night a year, everybody decks out their bikes with lights, LED lights, sound systems. They usually get dressed up in costumes. And this kind of roaming dance party makes its way around the bike lanes of Vancouver. It's really grown in a couple of years from a couple dozen people to over 7,000 this past summer. And the fact that it's on bicycles has almost become an afterthought. It's just become this giant social event that everybody comes out to. But it's also been a gateway drug, and some people we know. Trojan horse, do you prefer that one? A lot of people will try and beg, steal, or borrow a bicycle just to come out to this event, and then once they get riding for recreation, it's only a matter of time before they realize that transportation is just as easy and just as enjoyable. It's popped up in a couple other cities. Melbourne and Toronto have their own bike raid now, and maybe we can inspire Auckland to give one a try.
So I'm sure you're starting to hear it more and more in Auckland, but the big common phrase in Vancouver is that bikes mean business. And in general, bicycles have been very good for business in Vancouver. Businesses located on bike routes that once worried about loss of parking and congestion affecting their sales negatively have seen a boom. The picture on the left here features a gentleman that lives not too far away from the Union Bikeway with a business on that same bikeway, who owns a restaurant there. And when the suggestion went in to separate that route for bicycles, he stormed into City Hall and touted that separating in front of his store was going to be cutting his business off at the knees, which rhetoric like that is not uncommon in Vancouver. However, 1 year later, after the installation, he's quoted in a few of our media sources saying that business is now better than ever. And that's largely in part due to the number of tourists that now feel safe riding in front of his business, bringing much of their dollars into the local economy. Businesses now are even pushing for increased bike parking, which Chris made mention to earlier, to encourage cyclists to stop and spend money at these local stores. What we've even seen happen is local craft beer markets are now cropping up all along our bike routes, and seeing the value of being there. That center image there is one not too far away from where we live, which we frequent quite often. And it caters to people essentially on their way home or from work to pick up beer to share with their partner, or on their way downtown. It's a meeting place to stop and have a few before heading into downtown. Really, overall, it's just been fantastic for all those businesses, which Chris will talk about further. Did I go too far?
Try going back.
I did.
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry.
No, that's all right. So with these developments in recent years, Vancouver is establishing itself as a world-class cycling destination. Tourists are coming from around the world to ride our plentiful bikeways, our seawall, and our separated bike lanes on two wheels.
I didn't touch
Is
it.
that me?
I don't know.
Some hotels and other businesses are beginning to recognize this fact, providing free bike rentals, maps, and in the case of the Fairmont Pacific Rim, a bike butler who does tune-ups and gives directions and the like. It's kind of a cool little thing that we've seen pop up. We're also seeing a rise in curated themed bike tours. A number of companies have popped up that are offering visitors an intimate, first-hand way to see the city. And one of those companies is run by our friend Josh, and we made a short film about him.
There we go.
having a sense of wonder about the world and about everything around you and wanting to know more and find out the stories behind those things makes for a good tour guide. I studied finance and marketing in business school, and not wanting to work an office job, I decided to travel, and my travels took me all over the world. And in Japan, living in a small village, I fell in love with exploring my rural community by bicycle. Cycle City Tours was founded with the intent of telling stories about the city by bicycle. When it started, it was just myself, and we now have 8 guides touring groups around town. It's the content that shapes the foundation of a good tour, but it's the personal interaction, it's the informal chatting between the stops that allows for a unique experience. That personal connection is a much stronger memory than just seeing a site. I love what's happening right now with neighborhood establishments that are opening up. There's a great feeling when you go into a place that you know is locally owned. You know the people who work there live in the neighborhood. There's a great connection and a sense of place that you feel when you go into a place like that. A lot of people will tell you that running your own business is a lot like having a child. Your state of happiness or sadness or well-being is very much attached to this thing that you've helped to create. Well, I think what we're doing is we're telling stories. That's really the essence of what being a guide is, and that's what people are paying for when they join a guided tour. Just knowing that you've had an impact on somebody's experience, there's an intrinsic sense of happiness that comes through. It's a great feeling. My name is Josh. I'm the founder of Cycle City Tours. I tell stories by bicycle.
I'm just trying to make sure. There we go. So that's Vancouver. Most of the people that you've seen on the screen today wouldn't have been riding their bicycles 60 years ago, nor would they identify themselves as a cyclist. Rather, we consider ourselves citizens of a multimodal city, and we're combining bikes with walking, transit, and automobiles because of the investment in infrastructure that's enabled the former. It's what really keeps families like ours in Vancouver, and knowing, as you probably do, that we're not necessarily considered the most affordable city. By getting around by bicycle, it makes it affordable, accessible, and increases our quality of life and our overall happiness as a family.
So further to that, the 4 people that you see on the screen at the moment weren't riding bikes 6 years ago, and that's really what we're here to emphasize is the 60 to 70% concerned but interested. They're just regular people who wouldn't otherwise consider the bicycle, but if you make those investments in infrastructure, you will see the rewards further down the line. So what we've seen in Auckland while the 3 or 4 days we've been here has been reassuring, but you guys have a lot of work to do. We'd be happy to answer questions about that, but as you know, we didn't bring our children with us this time, but hopefully when we do return, we can bring them along, and they'll be able to ride bikes safely in Auckland as well. So good luck. Thanks for having us. We really appreciate it. Yeah, we can certainly open up the floor to questions if anybody has some.
Chris and Melissa, thank you very much. That was a wonderful presentation and really very encouraging. And as you say, we've got a lot of work to do here in Auckland, but I think there's a will to do much more. I'm sure there are some questions, and I think is there a microphone? There's some microphones as well. So does anyone want to ask a first question right at the front here? Microphone on its way.
You might be able to hear me anyway. The first one's a bit frivolous. Can you be drunk and charge up a bike in Vancouver?
Can you be, sorry? Drunk? Technically, no. Because it falls under the Motor Vehicle Act, it still has the same rules. You're not supposed to be intoxicated, and if you are stopped by the police, you could be charged with intoxication while operating a bicycle.
The second question is a bit more serious.
Okay.
Did you have to have an efficient public transportation network to start with your cycle program?
Did we have one? Is that or?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we've got a pretty extensive system of trolley buses, regular articulated buses. Yeah. I always forget the name. And as well, we also have our SkyTrain system. So that provides the connection and network throughout the city, and then the bicycles are an extension of that to really open up the city to all of its citizens. You're welcome.
And do you as a family use public transport as well?
Yes. So someone had mentioned earlier what happens when it's raining, and I just said we take the train.
Okay, more questions?
Hello.
One in the middle there. Yep.
Hello. Firstly, thank you for your great presentation. It was great to have such a positive presentation. My question is around debunking the myths around cycling and what your observations were around what the best forums or methods to debunk those myths were over the last 6, 7, 8 years, like cyclists are freeloaders, cyclists are lawbreakers, all those sorts of things.
Yeah, the one thing we will give the city tremendous credit for is they stuck to their guns, and even though the papers kind of went off with their own agenda, these cycle projects remain hugely popular. I think last count is the mayor had 65 to 70% approval rating, and he really ran. He wore these bike projects front and center. He wasn't hiding from them. So as we mentioned, he's been reelected a second term, and as if Ed polls are any indication, a third term is likely in the next couple of weeks. I think people are smart, and if you give them credit, they know that this is money well spent, and it will benefit everybody. I don't know if that answers your question, but yeah.
Okay, we've got a few questions at the front here. Yep.
Shall I? I don't know if this... Can everyone hear me all right?
Yep.
Of course, we spoke briefly before, but one size doesn't fit all, and the practical application of cargo bikes in our city, I question it with the geography that we have. Vancouver's flat. I didn't see any hills there, and I'm not sure that a laden person in a suit is going to cycle up Queen Street or Victoria Street to get to work. What part does geography have to play in cycling?
Yeah, it's an undeniable factor, much like the rain we have in Vancouver. But I think if you build safe space for cycling, people will use it. And there are technologies now, the Copenhagen wheel, electric assist, and if you provide cheaper means, I think people will flock to them. And there's no doubt we've spent some time in and around Auckland experiencing the hills, and they're a challenge. Further, outside of that, do you have anything to add?
Well, one thing I think, it's not the first time someone has mentioned that Vancouver is flat, and while we are not, in comparison to Auckland and Wellington, quite as hilly, we do have a ranging topography. It just so happens that every film we do seems to take place on a very flat area. But it is a concern for many people. What we tend to joke about in Vancouver is we find the alternate ways to get around the city, avoiding some of those hills. But the electric assist has started to play a big part in Vancouver, especially for those people looking to get on a bike, but maybe don't have the strength and aptitude to do that self-pedaled, I guess. Yeah. Larger statement is I think it's possible. Yes, and there is no shame in walking. That was my mantra when I first started riding.
All right. Another couple of questions in the middle here.
Yeah. So you mentioned housing affordability, which is obviously a bit of a concern in Auckland, although some people like to call it capital gains. There's a bit of a worry that there's always a worry with house prices that it's a factor driving people to leave the city, but obviously one of the ways you can get people to pay above the odds to live in a place is to provide a higher level of amenity for it. So having been to Auckland and seen a few bits of Auckland in the last week, what would you say some of the good opportunities that Auckland has at the moment to raise its level of amenity and offset some of those affordability issues?
Well, I think in terms of cycling, the biggest one would be providing that network outside of the central city. So your neighborhoods, that's going to be, if you can create that infrastructure out there to connect into the city and still allow the families that are living out there to get around from point A to point B safely, that's going to be one of the key things to help them move away from car ownership and be able to facilitate cycling and walking and public transit better, which is what has made Vancouver affordable for us.
Yeah, I will. I think Vancouver has similar problems around affordability, and it really permeates everything that we do, but we somehow make it work living in the city, and in part it's because we've shed the burden of car ownership, so we have a few $100 extra to put towards our housing costs.
I was just wondering how you go about, or what was involved in getting the bike racks on the buses. I used to live in Portland, Oregon, and 20 years ago Portland had bike racks on buses. And tell us how you did that, and is the municipal transit or transport municipally owned in Vancouver as opposed to, or is it a private bus network?
Yeah, it's a public network. The entire region of Metro Vancouver owns and operates it. In terms of the bike racks on the buses, just vision and leadership, I guess. I don't offhandedly know who made that push. Maybe somebody else in the room does, Darren. But again, it's just a policy that they managed to push through, and it's very rare that you now see a bus that doesn't have at least one bike on it. They're very well used.
I just wondered to what extent, you mentioned the importance of leadership and the mayor taking a lead in terms of promoting cycling culture, that to what extent there has been a strong cycling culture in your transport institutions, perhaps leading in terms of a normalised cycling culture, sit-up cycling and the like, because you said that being very positive.
Yeah, and it honestly, it hasn't existed, at least through official channels, and that's kind of what led to Melissa and I on this crazy journey through the Cycle Chic world, and Melissa's blogging is we didn't see the imagery being presented from our cycling coalition and from our city. Again, back to the mandatory helmets, they were by law required to show everybody wearing helmets, whereas we kind of exist outside that bubble, and we can present perhaps our vision of a bike culture looking a little more to Amsterdam and Copenhagen. So that's really what's driven us and what's gotten us to this point, at least, is a little bit of idealism and a little bit of romanticism. But around the official channels, things are still rather militant and rather sporty. And that's what we're trying to change.
We've got time for another 2 or 3 questions.
Thank you very much, Barb Cuthbert, Cycle Action. Thank you for coming. It's fantastic for us to hear from people who are on their bikes on the road rather than somebody sitting in an office. I mean, people in an office have a role as well, but your work is extremely important. What I'm interested to hear from you is you describe the evolution, which is what we need to see, and we're compressing it here in Auckland, absolutely determined. We're impatient. We're not going to be slowed down. But issue is money, and in the short term, removing car parking from arterial roads. You've covered that briefly in the earlier time. Are you still having to placate and compromise and find parking elsewhere, or has the culture now become so strong that you don't have to have those sort of trade-offs that you referred to initially?
That conversation is still happening in Vancouver. We are, in our neighborhood, we are in the midst of another proposal to put in a cycle track along the street that we do all of our shopping on. And we know that the business association is against it for the reason of parking and trying to justify that removing those 2 spaces and providing the means for people to stop on their bikes or make walking more accessible is still a hard fight. But the fact that we have now 6 and other examples of where it works and they're not going to lose money, it'll probably be even better for them, is thankfully something that we can provide to those businesses and prove to them that they're not going to be losing out. But sadly, we still have that struggle, even in a bike culture that seems to be accepting of all the new infrastructure we're getting. So, yeah, I don't know if you have anything to add.
Yeah, no, the one thing I will say is car use in Vancouver citywide is declining, and it's through, a great public transit system. It's through these investments in bike infrastructure, but it's also the expansion of car share. So we have 3 different car share schemes now, which we're members of 2 of them, and they all serve a different purpose, but they all facilitate the ability to hop in a car, pay $6 an hour for your gas insurance, and then from what I've read, the studies show that each one of these share cars replaces up to 20 private automobiles. So as we get all these systems in place, fewer and fewer people are owning cars and fewer people are using them. So the discussion around parking becomes a little bit easier when the demand for it is a little lower.
Right at the back there.
Hi there. I was just wondering where the stylish and not so stylish fast cyclists are riding since the new infrastructure's been put in place in Vancouver.
So we alluded to these bike boulevards or bikeways that were already existing in Vancouver. What they are is on a side street. Essentially, that's where most of our commuters will cycle because they're a little more unobstructed. They've put in roundabouts to ease the flow of traffic. That's where those 30-kilometer speed limits are put in, but then it also deters most motorists, so that's where they tend to end up. Not in terms of shoving them off to the side, but facilitating that longer trip at a higher speed. But then it does connect for when they need to stop for whatever reason on the way home. So they still are there and they're still being catered to. They're not disappearing from the streets. Ideally what this infrastructure is doing is catering to those that aren't cycling. So that's what the infrastructure is for, is not the people that are riding every day that are already happy to do so, but the ones that would like to but just aren't quite sure about it yet.
Thanks.
You're welcome.
One more question, right at the back.
Yes, in regard to infrastructure in Vancouver, apart from bike lanes on streets and segregated cycleways, have there been implemented within suburbs the equivalent of laneways connecting footpaths between small streets, cul-de-sacs, other types of larger streets? Has that been put into Vancouver, and has that been effective in actually encouraging cycling, for example, as you described before, to go down to the local shops or to get to school? Is that kind of infrastructure in Vancouver?
Unfortunately, we haven't seen a lot in the outer suburbs of Vancouver. I think a lot of them have been kind of waiting to see how this grand experiment in Vancouver goes, both politically and in terms of things like the parking and the businesses. But with the upcoming municipal election in a couple of weeks, we're seeing this conversation happening more and more in the suburban areas. And I think we're encouraged that it's only a matter of time before they hop on board as well.
Okay, I'm going to thank you for that. I'm going to ask on behalf of our sponsors, Jensen Varghese from MR Cagney is going to offer a vote of thanks. Jensen.
Right. So on behalf of MR Cagney and everyone here, Thanks to Chris and Melissa for a fascinating and very informative presentation. I want to thank Susan and the Auckland Conversations team for yet another great event. We're really excited to be part of the Auckland Conversations. It's a great dialogue about what people are doing all over the world and giving us ideas about how we can make Auckland and probably the rest of the world a better place. So as a company, we work in the transport planning urban mobility space, and you briefly touched on, I think, what you called bricks and mortar. But I think what was really interesting about this presentation was the softer side of things. So I've been cycling as an extension of walking. I was quite interested in the party on bikes idea and the fact that it was a gateway drug to commuter cycling. I hadn't heard of that before, but I can definitely understand where it's coming from. The catering for 8 to 80. And I guess one of the things about this presentation was that it was the perspectives of regular people. So a lot of the conversations or talk is about what we can do from a policy perspective or from an infrastructure perspective without enough thought about, I guess, the people that we're trying to cater for and how everyone needs to be on board and the message and getting that message across. It gives us an idea of what Auckland could be and what we could be striving for. So also, Chris and Melissa have been pretty active outside of these conversations, talking to media and getting this message across through a few other means as well. So we're quite grateful for that. So once again, please join me in thanking Chris and Melissa.